the death of the follower.
It does feel like followers doesn't matter. The number of followers you have in your account almost feels like a vanity metric now. And the algorithms has kind of set this level playing field now for all creators and brands. I think media companies are probably sweating.
Now, you don't need audiences to win the attention wars. You need content that seemingly... You move what you measure.
As a creator, does having a follower actually really matter? You find yourself more hooked to those discovery engine feeds. It's the reason TikTok grew so much.
The For You page pioneered, and now we have shorts and reels that all operate under a similar distribution method. This week's Memes and Machines. What the hell is the difference between Brits and America? And if you're a brand in both territories, how should you behave, act and think? What is the difference between a strategy and a creative brief? We agree a set of common definitions. You move what you measure. What do we mean by that, and how do you set smart goals? We explore the death of the follower, and finally we conclude with social media 3.0. What is it, and who is Yonchev?
What can the NBA playoffs teach you about marketing?
Catman, good to see you. You're looking taller after those NBA finals.
Yeah, it's definitely the shortest person in the room when watching those. But yeah, I've had a good week. Was enjoying an NBA game, probably my first in a few years, but the first time I've gone to a final, which is a very different atmosphere. If you go to like a league game in the NBA, like kind of regular season, feels like a bit more like an occasion, right? Like a bit more like a day at the pictures or something. You're not really, it doesn't feel like everyone's totally watching the game. Like people are there to have a hot dog and take a picture. But this was a game where the whole, it really felt electric. Like it was true fans. Everyone was there for the game. It was meant to be a historic night where the Knicks pulled on through, but they didn't. But yeah, I was definitely smacked in the face with American culture, which was always fun.
Always fun. Did you see any ads that you liked? They're not short of playing a few ads at those events.
I think my favorite was everybody on their seat had a little white towel, and every 20 minutes or so it would be Marriott towel time, and everyone had to spin the towel around above their head. And I just thought, I can't imagine this, on a Wednesday night in MK Dons. I don't think it would have gone down the same.
You don't think it would be
same?
Accepted at Barnsley Football Ground to do Mario towel? When you say that, it just reminds me of how corny, that you see these side-by-side videos of a British football game compared to an American sports game, and just the contrasting cultures is huge. I think that's an interesting topic more broadly, right? I think British culture, there's something I saw this week, and in the news over the last 2 weeks has been the hardest geezer, universally loved initially for his ordinary guy, death-defying feat, world first in the history books, amazing, incredible achievement for charity, just a wonderful story all round. And more recently, he's started to get hate, and it's just so British.
Yeah,
it's so British. Give me your take as a Brit that is still deeply patriotic and proud, but has spent now probably most of your adult life in America. Give me some of those differences that we should consider.
Yeah, it's interesting from like the personality standpoint, right? Like taking Harley Spears is a good example. There seems to be a general celebration and acceptance in the US of people securing the bag, right? Like when anybody gets their 15 minutes of fame, there is no shame in milking that moment, taking every single sponsorship you can, appearing on every TV show, having your moment. People love it. People love celebrating that kind of those characters and elevating them and putting them on a pedestal. And nobody really minds if they, pocket some cash in the process. Whereas in the UK, it tends to be that doing that is almost seen as impolite. It's seen as this kind of imposition on the general public that no, you shouldn't, you should just be modest about your achievements, and you should, take your applause and then fold
Queue.
away.
Join the queue, everybody else. Stop skipping the queue.
That's exactly it. Exactly. I've had to work 20 years for my moment, and this guy's, I mean, to be fair, around the land of Africa, I think he's an example where he's probably done more than most. But it did remind me that if Ross was an American, I think not only would he probably be even have an even bigger platform than he does now, but he would be celebrated in a way. And this kind of hate, which you see, and it isn't the majority, and this is one thing I will say, like, it still has a kind of overwhelming positive sentiment around it. But in the US, there wouldn't be any of this, kind of skeptical, almost like negative sentiment around the way he's holding himself. So that was a good reminder. And then I think being at the NBA game reminded me of kind of similarly the shamelessness of marketing and branding in the US, where again, it's generally accepted that brands, companies, whoever, can shamelessly plug what they're trying to do, can use every kind of tactic and trick in the book, fill up every moment of attention and every piece of surface area with their logo, with their branding. And that's kind of okay, because that's the market we live in, and that's what we're trying to do. I see in the UK, I see like people hate the fact that certain brands sponsor every podcast and appear in every, every kind of ad placement. People say, I keep seeing, like, I think I see Huel as an example. Which in my mind tells me they're doing an amazing job, right? They're very, very visible. And there tends to be this kind of feeling of, general dislike and distaste towards brands that are super visible.
Yeah, I think you summed it up perfectly in that the contrast in the US is you are conditioned just to accept being interrupted at all times.
Yeah.
Whether that's hearing a loud American voice on one hand, or whether that's a advert or a commercial every 8 minutes that goes on for 4 minutes. So then you get a few minutes of viewing time. And you're right, every surface area, anything that can possibly have a digital screen on it does. So they are, the more extreme end of capitalism. So you kind of expect that. What I would say is that there's a few interesting points that you raise about cultural differences. I was speaking to a brand earlier today, really successful brand. They've got a strong purpose-led story, incredible founder story, growing at a rapid rate. And we were discussing, who would be the ideal ambassador for them. And we're kind of throwing out names. And because of their story, on one hand, they really stand for these kind of extreme feats. They're very technical wear, you would use them in very harsh conditions, the most extreme materials and, the science that goes into building the product. And, on one hand, if they were an American business, you'd put like David Goggins front and center of them, get hard. They'd be that kind of mentality. But what they want to stand for is they want to carve a space, and they want to kind of be like the everyday, unassuming, odds-defying feats. And I'm definitely like, they're more harder skeezer than David Goggins. And it's really interesting. Yeah. I think those two parallels almost sum up cultures. You've got one guy who's quite self-deprecating, a bit of a lad's lad. And then you got like on the other end that take themselves seriously, that will be champion, that have this, there's a seriousness to what they do. And I think one of the mistakes, I'm not going to say mistakes, but maybe one of the learnings we had when we first entered the US was our mandate was often taking European brands into the US. And we just assumed because of the language, we would get it. And I think we quickly realized we didn't. And I don't think the US gets the US. One family in Atlanta is very different to a family in Florida and beyond, right? It's such a wide, diverse place. But my overall sentiment with UK US, I think the UK should learn a thing or two about US, US's ambition and the way that the
Optimism.
US optimism, yeah, that kind of hope that underpins. And conversely, if we're talking about advertising, I'd probably say the US could learn a thing or two from the UK, right? To tone it down, to be a bit more subtle. Subtle in your message. Subversive messaging is probably where I would draw the line or make the distinction.
Yeah, I think a lot of it actually comes down to just scale. The US is such a big place, and it's difficult when you're here to feel like you're in competition with anyone apart from yourself, because there's such opportunity here and there's so many people. Your market size is just by definition bigger. In the UK, it felt, and I remember really feeling this when we kind of contrasted building social chain in both markets. It almost feels like you're on top of each other. There's smaller markets, you have a smaller opportunity, and it feels more like winner takes all. And so as a result, there tends to be this kind of zero-sum game attitude towards business, marketing, just about anything. And as a result, you kind of get this, and you see it in, I observe it in a lot of kind of entrepreneurs and industries within the UK, that it tends to be, more insidious and more kind of competitive. Whereas in the US, it feels like everybody just wants you to win, and they understand that, a rising tide raises all boats. And I would also agree that the UK tends to have, I think, an edge on the more tasteful side of marketing. I think it's always felt like it leads in design and it leads in creative in a lot of ways. I think some of the best, and in my view, most groundbreaking ads have come from the UK. And I think that speaks to just more of a, like you said, taking themselves a little less seriously. I think that's what, and somebody who takes themselves less seriously tends to have more empathy and a better understanding of how the consumer is consuming something. And so, yeah, that's what I'd agree. I think the US can sometimes be a bit forget to kind of look outside their bubble.
Yeah, I agree, and it probably just stems from the rich history. Britain's always being punched above its weight in many respects, but particularly on the arts and culture and poetry, music, fine art. It's I think there's a deep-rooted appreciation in society, and that probably carries through into industry, right? In every sense of the word. Dude, I read something this week, and I thought it was a really interesting post, and I'd love to pick your brains on it. So the post basically said, and I'm going to read this verbatim, "A strategy and a creative brief are not the same thing." So that's the headline. And the person that wrote this, a senior strategist at a network agency, and I should give him credit, but I don't actually know. I can't remember why I wrote this down, but I do think it was interesting. And he said, strategy happens first. Big decisions are made here. It involves sacrificing all alternative avenues. It sets direction. Creative briefs are one of many possible expressions of a strategy. One of the most common mistakes people make is believing their creative brief is in fact a strategy. A creative brief is an opportunity to walk the talk. A strategy is a commitment to the talk. And I thought that overall description, particularly the latter part, was a beautiful articulation of the distinction between strategy and creative. In your world, how do you make a practical distinction between strategy and creative, and what role does strategy play in a business like Third Web that's evolving so quickly, where I assume you have to be, it's more strategy in action, or we're certainly with the bias for action, right?
Yeah, I think, as like a tech startup, it is very much like we don't really have time to, long strategy projects, but we do strategize, and we tend to do a lot of stuff retrospectively. So we execute a lot. We look at what works in the past, and then we say, okay, this is how we're going to do this moving forward. But I really think it's important to not forget, at a company like ours, to, reset everybody on what the strategy is here. Because you can very quickly get into a rhythm where you're just executing. And you forget that your team aren't clear on what their, overall mission is or what the kind of, guiding strategy looks like. I really like that distinction because I've read a lot of creative briefs previously that do feel like they haven't done strategic thinking and they're looking for the creative team on the other end to do that for them. And so like, whenever I write creative briefs, so like a video for design, whatever it looks like, whatever it is, I'm always very, very specific, ultra specific, because I agree that you're not in that moment trying to think of the kind of strategy or think of, you're not actually trying to do too much creative thinking there. You're just trying to execute. You're trying to produce the output that the strategy should have directed. So I think that's a good way to think about it, and it's probably not something I'd ever articulated, but I remember getting feedback from someone I worked with who said, I like your briefs because I don't have to think much. They're very specific and they're very precise. And I think that is sometimes missing because, the strategy should be so good that the creative briefs are kind of easier to then produce. But yeah, to be honest, I haven't been in an environment with too much strategy or creative briefing for maybe 3 years now. So I'm curious to see how it's evolved and hear how it's evolved.
Yeah, my definition of strategy, particularly in a world that's so noisy and we have so many choices, is always the removal of noise. Strategy is removing noise, not doing more things. It's creating clarity. It's putting intention into everything you do. But I think creative is always, and I love the word creative, is the expression of a strategy. It's one manifestation. And that's what it probably should be, right? What I would say, my probably underlying belief now as it relates to kind of any marketing activity, there's big S and there's little s. Big strategy is more mission-led. Here's what we're trying to do. This is the direction we're going. Little s is a bit more tactical and little s changes. And it's the intention based on the context of now and the choices you have and the budget and all the parameters and factors. I actually think the big S, the big strategy, the direction, what you're doing, who you're serving, those things should be probably solidified and shouldn't change that often. They need to. You need to be consistent and resilient and relentless in the pursuit of anything that's worthy. So I believe big S should be solidified, little s being small strategy, should be tactical, should be open to interpretation, and then the creative is simply an expression. Should strategy, I think one of the things that I think brands can feel guilty on is investing tons of energy in a strategy and it just not working and just keep doing it. I do think that's a problem. And again, using my own definition, I'll say small s strategies. They'll stay on track and just keep doing it because maybe they've brought in an agency and it's very difficult to admit that you're wrong and you've just spent £100,000 on, developing a plan and 6 months worth of time and it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard to do. It's something that I hope we get better at, is having the integrity and willingness to say when we're wrong. Not easy to do, by the way, particularly as an outside party where you are as invested, but you're not as accountable. And that's a challenge, right? So that's probably my lay of the land right now in strategy and creative.
Interesting. And do you find that, and this is maybe a bit quite technical, but when you're working with brands on strategy, how much of it is they have no idea, right? So it's starting from scratch, and how much of it is they have a kind of already a pretty clear strategy. They're looking for almost confirmation or some direction.
I see two things, two dynamics. You have startups and you have enterprise corporations. I'm going to just bundle companies into those two categories. Almost every startup we work with is, and I don't mean this to sound disrespectful, but they all have an identity crisis. They're all trying a million things. They're all seeking validation and answers. And I think that can create quite a confusing place unless you're a marketeer or an agency with high convictions. You've got to have a real strength of character to be able to say to someone who's paying you a sum, you need to stop doing that. to a startup founder, that's the wrong thing to do. You're actually guiding your team down the wrong decision. You need to stop bringing 20 people to meetings because you're wasting your money. Like, these are things that, I think we don't always do it, but I hope we aspire to that. We build confidence in our teams to be able to deliver that type of news. Conversely, I think in large corporations, you tend to have much more focused people that almost feel like they have hands tied behind their back. So most of the people, they can be really shrewd, really sharp, always have similar ambitions to do great work and interesting work and be more creative. But there's a sense that they have the corporate hoops to jump through and the rigorous sign-off processes and the pace at which they can move to truly be effective. I do think in both categories, you probably have some outliers. You see corporations that, go viral once on TikTok, they become hooked, or they have that really successful early campaign and it sets a new bar and precedence for what's expected of them. And they earn the authority to show up in a certain way that's creative and interesting. And then equally, you see the same in some startups that find their niche and they're laser focused in what they do. So I talk in absolutes, but they're my general observations of companies. I would say there's definitely a lot of big strategy in big companies. I would say they feel like they have a restricted strategy if I'm using my smallest definition. And I think by large startups are the opposite. It feels like they're full of tactics, full of agility, but they lack complete direction. And I empathize with that. God, we had at Flight Story, we had an identity crisis for a year, doing stuff, trying stuff, figuring things out. And that's okay. It's not a judgment. It's just a common theme.
Yep. Yeah, you're looking for traction in one direction, and then that forms your strategy. But I think for a lot of time, all you can do is execute. All you can do is do stuff and see what happens.
Can I ask you a question? I've noticed and this is just from early days when we were working together more, a lot of your storytelling and marketing was, I suppose, advocating for the sector in many respects. And it was telling a lot more of the macro stories. It seems now, and is it just the evolution of the company and the product range and the services? Because it definitely feels more product focused than technical in terms of almost all your communication. Has that been intentional, and is that just, I suppose, the maturing of the company or the focus of the audience?
It's maturing of the company and maturing of the industry. So in the early days, this was almost felt like day one of Web3. NFTs had just kind of entered the hive mind.
Yeah.
Nobody really knew what the technology was for, and actually, telling the macro story was all we could really do, because we actually didn't know how people were going to build products or use our software, right? So there was this kind of very, there's a lot of vague, unknown speculation, and I think we did a good job of leaning into that. Let's tell the story of the industry. Let's get people excited and raise awareness of our product. And then, we're now 2.5 years in. We're now starting to see a lot of those speculative kind of ideas come to fruition, where, real apps, real games are being built using blockchain technology. So the product has evolved from this kind of speculative state to now, okay, people are using it and people are winning with it. People are actually producing valuable things with it. And so the strategy now has to be, how do we amplify those moments? How do we tell those stories? Because that's actually what's going to then convert more people to then go and use those. And this kind of macro aspirational story, it's still important, but we actually have eyes on us now. We actually have the attention. We have an audience, right? We have tens of thousands of people who will consume our content. And the more interesting thing now is, how do we go deeper on our product? How do we really become a technical leader in the space, as opposed to this kind of let's just appeal to the kind of broader audience. So I think maybe that's what a lot of startups end up doing, is you start broad, right? You capture the imaginations of everybody in tech. You then figure out who your core audience are, and you go much, much deeper. You really kind of help them get to success with whatever you're building.
I think as an overarching mental model for startup marketing, it's probably a really good one, right?
Yeah.
The idea of you're going to have a lot of ideas which products and features people will like. You probably haven't found product market fit yet, but through the process of maybe going a lot broader, I can imagine a lot of that early intelligence where you'd pick a theme, like you'd talk about a music case study, and maybe your reception was more lukewarm or not the right people. It helps, I suppose, dial in over time what themes and pillars.
Yeah.
So I think there's probably wisdom as a model for probably most startups, right?
Absolutely. And what you get is, as you grow, you get an immense amount of insight into your customers and an immense amount of insight into, the data, right? And what you learn to do is kind of separate what you see on social media and what you see in the market with what is actually happening. So like, that's a good example where in our industry, we'll see a lot of noise made about, Web3 and music. Like Web3 is going to transform the music industry. So that's a story we told over and over again. Actually, 2.5 years in, we look at our data, we look at the market, nobody succeeded that. Nobody has built anything with any kind of meaningful traction in the kind of music Web3 space. However, gaming is flying. There are hundreds of game studios using our product and making, pretty significant revenue. And that's actually the data that matters, not the thousands of Twitter retweets, right? So like you learn to distinguish what is real, like what is the real stuff, and what is the stuff that appears real and makes people think is happening. And so that's where our strategy is heavily guided by our customers and who are the people in the market actually making money and actually using this stuff to build something real and build something tangible. And I think you could apply that to any startup where you learn pretty quickly that in some industries, like you see a lot of noise. I think AI is a good example where there was probably a lot of noise around people building photo booth apps, right? Which is interesting. There's definitely some real traction happening there, but there's a million other more interesting real use cases happening, kind of bubbling under the surface, and that's the actual real stuff that is, long term and interesting.
Yeah, I tend to think, because I'm hearing you articulate that, my mind was going to AI as well. I was thinking, think of all a year ago, the user cases that people got really enthused by. I actually think we're probably overplaying the kind of investment in avatars. There's been a lot of news this week. I don't know if you've seen Reid Hoffman's, not Reid Hoffman. Is it Reid Hoffman? LinkedIn founder? I forgot his name. Anyway, tech figure basically launched did an interview with himself as an avatar. Really good, really impressive. As a display of technology, phenomenal, right? Then I kind of go, probably could just film yourself anyway. You know what I mean? There's part of me goes, we build things and go, the fake version might look exactly the same as the real version, but you could just do the real version. It's innovation for the sake of innovation. We're seeing a lot of that. We've seen this roll out in certain like automation people get excited about. So yeah, I feel you on those points. Very quickly, one of my favorite Cattyisms, well, my favorite, is hands-on keyboard. But one of my second favorite Cattyism is something that you said a few weeks ago. You said, you move what you measure. You move what you measure, and I think it's a beautiful phrase. And when you said that, I connected it with an article that I read that basically described the death of the follower. And really, the whole article describes how social media's evolved, where we've moved from audience graphs, so having followers and being able to access your audience and reach more people, to interest-based graphs. So think of all the discovery engines that they say the For You page pioneered, and now we have shorts and reels that all operate under a similar sort of distribution method. What it leads to is this fact that now You don't need audiences to win the attention wars. You need content that seemingly shares certain characteristics to become popular. And a lot of people are like anti-algorithm because of that. They're like, I hate just doing these same formulas that we know. You know, you've seen the videos where someone's holding a little microphone and like walking around. You've seen how many like shock ads are now appearing where it's like someone's been run over by a car, then it goes and it's promoting a takeaway shop down the road. You know, there's like, we're doing all these same tactics and models all the time. And that's the game that's being played. So my question to you is, if we can agree that the follower doesn't mean as much anymore, what should we be measuring in social media? What do we move in order... what do we measure in order to move the needle, I suppose is my broader point.
It's a really good topic. I've been thinking a lot about this because it does feel like followers doesn't matter. And the number of followers you have in your account almost feels like a vanity metric now, because somebody with a small percentage of the number of followers of you, if they create better content, it will reach more people. And the algorithms has kind of almost like set this level playing field now for all creators and brands. I think media companies are probably sweating. They have these huge audiences, but actually it doesn't matter because, like you said, the engines now work in a way that will push that content out to the right audience. It doesn't necessarily, it's not going to rely on people following an account. And you'll find that in your feeds. You'll see in your Twitter feed now, you'll see in your Instagram feed, but a lot of the content is from accounts you don't follow. And so as a creator, does having a follower actually really matter anymore? But then I think a bit more about it, and the behavior of following an account still exists, right? So people still want a way to see a creator they like, see a page they like, and they want to see that content when they're pushing out, right? So
would you say that's what X have done fundamentally by segmenting the feed? You're seeing that a lot, kind of variations of feeds, and the intention is the For You page was the same. I don't think anyone ever clicks into the other tab to see who you follow on TikTok, but I don't know,
exactly.
Is that the future? Is it just this personalized tab versus this kind of discovery tab? Is that where we're headed everywhere?
Exactly. I 100% think so, because as much as people say they don't want it, it is actually a better experience. And you find yourself more hooked to those kind of discovery engine feeds. It's the reason TikTok grew so much. And it's the reason why Twitter is probably starting to, again, I will say Twitter feels like a worse experience for a number of reasons, but the recommendation engine is getting good. It's getting as good as TikTok. And so I think we're heading towards a future where the number of followers you have isn't super important. But like I said, because the behavior of following still exists, the follower is still a signal that you are consistently creating content that resonates. And the only way you're going to win, right, is by consistently creating content. It gets good engagement. You get the data and the feedback loop of how to create the next great piece of content, and you go again, you repeat and you repeat and you repeat. And so your follower number is still going to compound there. And once you get past a certain amount of influence, then yes, I think having 1 million followers will give you the edge over a smaller creator. That's just, that's kind of a given.
It's interesting though, because the industry, if I talk the advertising industry, social media specifically, it certainly hasn't caught up. If you establish how the creator economy, how creators charge, it's largely linked to the size of their following, loose, crudely, and I'm sure people use different metrics, but the majority of the industry still operates on that. I would argue, if you're a new brand, a startup, and you have limited to no social following, I think the innate human social proofing that one number does adds value. So I'm always conflicted with this question around does the follower count, because I know it shouldn't. I know it serves less distribution value than it ever has some value, but a lot less than it ever has. But then part of me knows that the follower count does have some fugazi intrinsic value in a number of other ways. But I suppose it begs the question then, what do you actually measure depending on, what is it you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to book a creator and you're trying to value their worth, what are the metrics that you look at in order to determine someone's worth? You could get really specific and go like commercial posts. When they work with a brand, what's the average reach of the last 6 commercial posts that they do based on the delivery? And, I think we're going to have to get to a point where metrics are set per the intention, not these kind of crude headlines that we tend to have the industry governed by.
So this is why podcast advertising is such a lucrative and growing method of advertising, and why I think there is this kind of rush for podcast. And that's because every single individual show that is marketing or sponsored by podcast has a unique code which the listeners of that show will use to then get a discount, so they can directly attribute the influence that show is having over sales, right? And every other kind of creative marketing doesn't have that really. So like when you say, how do you measure what is successful? What we measure, so Third Web, the way we have it is we can see how many users will come from a social network to our platform, and then we can also see how many users then went and added a payment method to their account. That signals that they have some kind of they have high intent. They want to use one of our paid products. They're a real developer. They're somebody who's trying to, build something meaningful. And so we're now able to see like a bit further down the funnel, right? Like Twitter is our highest performing channel for that metric. And that's great. That ticks the box. Like that's a theory we've had, but now we actually can, put some meaning behind it.
You're talking organic, not paid.
Yeah, no paid whatsoever.
Right.
So this is all organic. And we're able to see interesting things. Like, for example, Twitter delivers the same number of paid users as our blog. And we spend a fraction of the time on our blog as we do on Twitter. And so that was a great moment for me to say to our team, right, we need to actually shift our strategy here, because if we put 2x the amount of effort into our blog as we do Twitter, we're probably going to get 10x returns.
Yeah.
And so you just have to get really good at understanding what are the numbers that really matter, that actually change, actually influence the business further down the funnel, because there's a lot of noise that you have to sift through aside from that.
Yeah, I think we should call these SMART goals.
Right.
It reminded me a little bit of when you talk about company growth. One of my contacts runs a really successful e-commerce business, and he shared a comment just around his thinking, and he says growing a company 70% in a year sounds ridiculous, right? However, and this is where he says set those SMART goals. How many companies set the headline metric? We're going to do this. We're going to get from here to here. It's a good start, but it's not nearly enough. He wrote, however, if I said grow customers by 30%, okay, I guess 30% of the people that come in will get new. Increase prices by 10, that's another SMART metric. Increase our order frequency by 20%. All sounds doable. We want people to be more frequent. That would grow revenue by 71%. The point being, if I was to think about SMART goals in social, you need to get under the hood. You go, okay, what if I took my last 10 videos, what's the retention rate? If my average retention is 30% or 25%, what happens if I get to 40%? And suddenly, what if I measure the volume of conversation that I have, the number of comments? Pick any metric, set yourself a bar and a parameter. The compounding impact of multiple factors increasing suddenly mean you have a much better outcome, and you probably overachieve on those macro goals. So I suppose my takeaway, and I thought it was a really nice articulation, but I think marketeers, it was kind of sales articulation. I think marketeers can just learn from that. Is sure, set our intention, the big number, but also get smart about the goals and what you measure. And it's something that I've certainly noticed on our on our own marketing channels where I'm probably not as privy to the data anymore or not as observant and not got the reporting metrics in place, our performance has really stagnated as a consequence of me paying no attention to it. So, you know, like resetting those SMART goals and making sure everyone's orientating around them, I think is super important.
Yeah, you move what measures.
You move what measures. Favorite line.
No, you move what you measure.
Move. I'm going to say it's one of those lines that I've heard you say it multiple times and you fuck it up every time. I've said it like 3 times and I've fucked it up every time. It's like such a simple sentence.
I'm all in.
So, dude, is there anything else you found interesting? Any interesting conversations you've had with your team or anything you've seen this week?
Yeah, so actually just before this was speaking to the whole company, kind of gave a short presentation and something that we've been thinking about from a kind of executive level for a while now around a huge part of our content strategy being that all of our developers, all of our team members should be expected to create content around the products that we ship. Right. And I see this a lot, and it's kind of a trend I'm seeing, and I think it's very closely tied to the point we were talking about earlier with the kind of death of the follower, right? Like, because you have this very kind of algorithmically driven feed, you have a recommendation engine which is now powering what content we receive. People don't really want to consume content for brands. It tends to be the thing you skip over, right? Like, it tends to be something that you look at and you'll see if it kind of grabs your attention. And so naturally, I think what we're going to see is the domination of personal accounts, right? So like, we're going to see more and more people on our feed and fewer brands. What that means for companies is that their strategy should be, okay, how do we really kind of engage our team to post and share the updates, the products that they ship, right? Because otherwise you're relying on your audience and your reach, which is going to be clipped by the social algorithms. And so I'm seeing it with, a lot of big tech companies now. I think the old way used to be let's create a shiny video and tweet it out on our personal account. What I'm now seeing is the CEO will get on Bloom, which is like a screen capture service, and they'll click through a product demo, no editing, super authentic, super grassroots, and they'll tweet it out. And that's actually getting a lot more reach than their personal, their company brand accounts are. So it's a strategy that we're kind of shifting towards now, because I feel like we're just going to see fewer and fewer brands on the home feed. And so brands should be thinking about, is our founder, our CEO, is he visible, or he or she visible? Are they emitting content around the brand? And then how are the team members also empowered to do the same?
I think it's a good point. Did you get any resistance? Because I know some people feel it's a bit of an overreach for an employer to get behind. I know you guys are like anchored to the mission, and probably like, I don't know, is that applicable for everybody? Because I agree with you.
No, it's a good point, but to be honest, the way we positioned it is this is integral to the success of the company, right?
Yeah,
we have to do this to win.
Yeah.
If we're only going to win if we rely on third web tweeting out every single product we ship. We're just not going to reach the amount of people that we need to reach to win in this market.
Yeah.
But, our principal engineer, he posted a product update we did the other week, and it got like 60, 70K views, 10 times what we could have got. Right. Yeah. So like, we have to do it to win. I know that not everybody is going to be there to appear in front of camera, and they're not going to want to, they may not have that content creation muscle. What we said is that we have a marketing team who you should look at as like a producer, as publishers. Like, send us 5 bullet points and we'll create an article for you. Like, send us a crappy video, we'll edit it, we'll polish it up, we'll write a tweet for you. Let's do something, get from 0 to 1, and then we'll execute the rest.
I think that's a great point, is you're giving, and we would do the same around key moments. We call it the thunderclap, and we write the brief, and we give multiple links to download and recommendations. I think the key is lowering the barrier to create for everybody, showing that as an organization you care. I actually think you being really upfront as an organization and saying this will enhance our chances of winning. And if company wins, we all win. Like there is something in that. And I don't know if you can have if there's the same sense of pride and ownership in non-startups. I think it's quite easy to galvanize that in a startup. I'm not necessarily as convinced in a bigger company. However, I do think, I'd be disheartened if people weren't taking pride in their work and wanting to celebrate their colleagues and the things that the company are doing that are interesting. I just think it's kind of good character. It's interesting as well, as you were describing that to me, you're preaching to the converted. I did think about my general thesis on social media today, and my thesis is that we have moved away from channels, and now social media is an ecosystem. And it doesn't matter as much about what you say about yourself, it's how others talk about you. And the more people that are talking about you, that are co-creating with you, that are sharing with you, that are contributing, commenting, all of this is surface area that you have an opportunity to communicate what you do in a number of ways. So everything you're describing there is very much that kind of ecosystem model of social media. And I would say, if I'm a brand, there's probably a more radical approach that goes against the convention we've been teaching people for 10 years, is like, less channels, more intention, focus, grow big audiences. Maybe the right strategy today is set up 50 channels and write different posts from all of those channels, and they're built around passions or a small little flavor or fragment of your brand, or that like one piece or that one feature. Equally do the same with your employees, your team members, your partners. Just create these kind of moments that people can take, grab, and distribute. Maybe that's the strategy. In an ecosystem-based social media, that's probably the most effective thing you can do. I want to try that now. I'm going to pitch that to someone because I think it's a pretty good idea.
Love it.
Cool. On that note, brother, it's getting up to midnight for me. So I am going to bounce. I'm going to go to bed. I'm going to get my beauty sleep. And the cat man is going to meow into the night and probably do some very bougie, Manhattan-y, Williamsburg-y things, right?
Yeah, I'm going to go cook, gym, bed.
Are you cooking these days?
Yeah, I cook every day, man. Cook every day.
I didn't know you were a cook. I learned something new about you.
No, I'm not saying I'm a cook. I'm saying I cook. It's two different things. Two different things there. I cook badly. What I learned, and this is my last teacher of American Alpha, if you want to stay fit, you stay in shape in the US, you have to cook. There's no other option. As I got older and my metabolism started to, test me, I realized that whatever they put in the food here, you have to control the ingredients, otherwise you get nowhere.
100%, bro. I remember there was a period, I'm like 3 years into my US journey, and I remember seeing Alessio and Joe, and they called me Henchev, and I took it as a compliment. I'm going to the gym. I look back at those pictures, I was fat. I mean, thinking I was hench. No, I was fat.
Good stuff.
I'll catch you next week.
See you soon.